Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 336. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Very good, Connor. Got a lot to talk about today. Great power with Russia and China. I'll be covering Russia. You got a bunch of stuff on China that's really important. So everybody, please share today's show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts if you want to listen on the go. And to support the show by buying your CBD products with Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Connor, what do you like from Paloma Verde?
I'm a big fan of the tinctures. I think that's the best bang for your buck. It's the strongest stuff, and it lasts a very long time. And you can add it to food, drinks, whatever you got. Really effective pain relief. And as I've said before, I just get a great night's sleep every time I use it toward the end of the night. Then the soft gels are perfect because you can take those with you wherever you go. Take them after meals. They'll hit you in a half hour, and anything you're dealing with in your entire, and if you got foot pain or if you got neck pain, it'll hit it. And you'll get incredible relief from that. The soft gels are just fantastic. And then the gummy bears are delicious. You can take those on the go as well. And the doggy treats are a big favorite of my Doberman, who's now about 11 years old. So she can use the assistance with her, if she's got a little bit of pain in her joints, or if it just helps her calm down and get some nice rest. It's always a great thing.
All right. Thanks, Connor. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. And let's get into the episode.
Okay.
All right, Connor, the first story I have today, and sorry, everyone, it's pretty much all bad news, top to bottom. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on October 11th. Report, U.S. officials have ruled out pushing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. U.S. officials have ruled out pushing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, even though they don't think either side can win the war outright, the Washington Post reported on Tuesday. The report reads, privately, U.S. officials say neither Russia nor Ukraine is capable of winning the war outright, but they have ruled out the idea of pushing or even nudging Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. They say that they do not know what the end of the war looks like or how it might end or when, insisting that's all up to Kiev. A State Department official told the Post that the issue of ending the war is a decision for the Ukrainians to make. The official said that Washington's job is now to help them be in absolutely the best position militarily on the battlefield for that day when they do choose to go to the negotiating table. And kind of, we were just talking about this before the show, but if you continue to give Ukraine weapons and don't even ask them to negotiate with Russia, you're just completely writing a blank check for war, and you're telling Ukraine to go to war. If you got a friend that's all upset and hot-headed, and you don't give him any advice at all about calming down, and you hand him a gun, and then the next day he comes back by and you hand him another gun, and you do the same thing again and again and again. You're telling this guy, hey, keep fighting, keep going to war. And that's what the U.S. is doing here. And it's amazing that we're getting this reporting from the Washington Post, just openly acknowledging that, the White House understands that this is the situation, that this war could go on. And we're going to talk here a decade, Connor. They're actually talking about this war going on for, and yet they have no plans, even though they know that, at the end of this road is a potential nuclear war with Russia. That's something that our President Joe Biden said, that they have no plans or intentions to even say to the Ukrainians, hey, we're giving you weapons, but understand that your best position to negotiate may be now. And so maybe now is the time to negotiate so that we can end the bloodshed. They're just outright refusing to do any of that. It's quite astounding. Now, on the other side of the table, the Russians say that they are open to talks. This again from October 11th in Dave DeCamp. Lavrov says Russia open to talks with the West. U.S. dismisses his comments. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Tuesday that Moscow was open to talks with Western powers as Turkey is looking to broker negotiations. Lavrov also said that Russia would consider a meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Joe Biden if one were proposed. We have repeatedly said we never refuse meetings. if there's a proposal, then we will consider it. And so, Connor, this is, I think, something that should be really important here, that, talks and diplomacy could be happening right now. Russia isn't saying that they're completely unwilling to negotiate at all. And look, even if that diplomacy doesn't lead to a deal because Russia doesn't want one, sitting down and figuring out if there's any way we could get ceasefires in certain areas and, tone down the fighting at all, that could be things that really save the lives of Ukrainians. And I mean, it's pretty much straight up the position of the White House now that, Biden won't talk to Putin on this particular issue. And we then get comments, and Dave DeCamp wrote this up the next day for antiwar.com, saying that President Biden told CNN's Jay Tapper in an interview that aired Tuesday night that he has no intention of meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin or negotiating with Russia over Ukraine. Biden left open the possibility of discussing a potential prisoner swap for Brittany Grenier, the WNBA star that was arrested in Russia for drug possession, but completely ruled out, discussing the war in Ukraine. Connor, this seems baffling to me that, he, again, wouldn't at least talk to Putin about this, get a feeling of where Putin is on this. And for the very least, the reason of, how seriously do we have to take the president and things like that. But Biden wants no part of that, no part of negotiations whatsoever. Again, this is striking, especially as we look at the next article, and again from antiwar.com. NATO has a 10-year plan to rebuild Ukraine's military. NATO is developing a 10-year plan to rebuild Ukraine's military and arms industry with a focus on shifting from the country's using Soviet equipment to primarily using NATO weapons, Politico reported on Wednesday. And this is something that myself and I believe Will Porter wrote about at the Libertarian Institute probably 2 to 4 months ago, that all these countries are now within the NATO orbit, right? All these former Warsaw Pact or USSR are countries, and so firmly within the EU, firmly within the NATO structure, and that means that they've adopted the American sanctions, and yet they all use Soviet era weapons. And so that means they're not going to buy replacement parts and things like that for their weapons. And so, a while ago, they were already looking at this and planning to build Ukraine a NATO military, but now they've just officially rolled out the plan. Dave writes, the first meeting between NATO and Ukraine on the plan is set to be held next week. NATO acquisition officials held meetings this month to discuss ways to help Ukraine's defense industry and how to ramp up their armed production to replenish stockpiles of weapons that have been sent to Ukraine. And Connor, this is one of those things where the Ukrainian government is already heavily dependent on Western countries for aid. Just today, Zelensky is asking for $55 billion to cover the budget deficit and fund reconstruction. And so, they're talking about money on top of this, that now we're going to rebuild Ukraine's defense industry and help them to acquire all these very expensive NATO weapons for a country that doesn't even have the money to feed its own people, is going to present a real problem and a huge expenditure. Now, this is where we get into this war is going to last a long time, according to Western officials, Connor. This from Dave DeCamp on October 12th. Austin says Ukraine will be on the offensive through winter, vows support for years ahead. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on Wednesday predicted that Ukraine will be on the offensive throughout the winter and vowed the U.S. would continue supporting Ukraine with weapons in the difficult weeks, months, and years ahead. Austin made the comments in Brussels after leading a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which consists of military officials from about 50 nations. I expect that Ukraine will continue to do everything it can throughout the winter to regain its territory and to be effective on the battlefield. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure they have what they need that's required to be effective. Ukraine recently made gains in the southern Kherson region and in the eastern Kharkiv region. Its offensives have now stalled, and Russia is reinforcing its positions after Russian President Vladimir Putin called up 300,000 fresh troops and its territories Russia controlled in Ukraine. And so Connor, this is, Austin saying that this thing is going to last a long time, years to come. Now, there's been some significant escalations in the war in Ukraine that we really haven't covered on the show. As I've talked about, I find it very hard to cover the battlefield here. And one of the reasons is a lot of people react to, in news immediately, this town was taken, that town was taken. And then, of course, Connor, every single town that's, next to be taken is the most critical town for, the transport flows through here. There's trains, and all that, of course, is important. But oftentimes, gains are not as significant or as permanent as initially predicted. And so we haven't covered a lot of battlefield stuff recently, but we did cover Ukraine's major offensive in the Kharkiv regions, and did talk about, while there was a lot of prediction that Russia would immediately launch a counteroffensive, crush those troops, that hasn't happened. And Ukrainian forces have held this territory for several weeks now. They made smaller incursions in the southern Kherson region, and it doesn't seem like those offensives were quite as successful. Now, Russia has launched a retaliatory offensive, I believe, in the south, more towards the Kherson region, has made just a little bit of gains, and who knows if those will last. More importantly than the actual, I think, territory changing hands, though, Connor, is the major escalation that we saw when a bomb exploded on the Kerch Bridge, which links the Russian mainland with the Crimean Peninsula, which I guess is now like all attached. If you look at the annexation maps, there's a full good chunk of Russian territory that reaches around the Sea of Azov and then down to the Crimean Peninsula. But, from the map from 2014 to 2022, the Crimean Peninsula was only connected to Russia via this bridge. And so, this is a pretty significant act. It was a truck bomb that exploded on the bridge. Connor, it's still unclear to me if this was a suicide bomber situation or if this was maybe a unwitting person who was driving the truck, not realizing it had a bomb on it when it was exploded. But nonetheless, the Ukrainians are claiming that they carried out that attack. I believe the bridge has reopened to some extent, but probably isn't doing everything that it was doing before the explosion on the bridge. In response, the Russians launched a pretty significant missile barrage on Ukraine, and from Ukrainian sources, they said that Russia took out, I think, somewhere around 30% of Ukraine's electrical infrastructure. Now, Ukraine claims that they shot down well over 60% of the Russian missiles, including cruise missiles. I read in the New York Times that they claim they shot down not the entire Ukrainian army, Connor, but like one unit shot down 2 cruise missiles with shoulder-fired helicopter, man pads, which, I was looking up the range of those man pads, which is about 2 miles, Connor. And so even if that missile flew directly overhead and was flying at its slowest speed, a Mach 1, that's going to put that missile over that person for maybe in range of the man pad for about 40 seconds. I see no possible way that they actually shot down a cruise missile with a man pad, and certainly not twice. Like, maybe just bullets, you fire them in the air and eventually you hit something. And look, for years and years, there's been reports that the Houthis have shot down Saudi warplanes like Tornadoes or F-15-16s with man pads. And we've always been very skeptical of that because of how difficult it is. Now, if those planes are flying particularly low and slow, then they may be somewhat susceptible. But, these missiles weren't lazily flying over Ukraine when they were taken down. They were on their way to targets. And so I'm very doubtful of the Ukrainian claims about how successful their missile defense systems actually are. However, Connor, I will say that we saw, quite a bit in the Syrian war, that there's a lot of I don't want to call it cyber warfare because I think that's a little bit maybe misleading, but certainly non-physical types of missile defense. Different ways to interfere with the signals going to the missiles and cause them to detonate or crash into the ground, hit a different target, something like that. And this again has happened quite a bit over Syria. I think Russia pretty successfully disabled a lot of the American Tomahawk missiles, a part of Trump's last strike in Syria. And so, these things could be going on in Ukraine, and we're just not getting that message through. But my guess of what happened is that Ukraine just really overestimated the amount of missiles that Russia fired and then overcounted the amount that they ended up shooting down. So, this has been a pretty significant escalation in Ukraine over the past couple of days and has led the White House, NATO, and the European Union, all the countries of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, to come together and pledge to deliver more advanced air defense systems to Ukraine. One of the reasons, Connor, that I'm so skeptical that Ukraine was able to shoot down all those missiles is that they're only using S-300 systems. And so they're going to get the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems. These are a little bit more advanced, but I don't think they're sending Patriot missiles or anything like that to Ukraine at this point. The last article I have today, before I hand it over to Connor here, is the one that Will Porter wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Today, October 13th, UN rejects Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territories. The United Nations has voted to condemn Russia's annexation of 4 regions in eastern Ukraine, denouncing the move as a legal land grab, while questioning the results of referendums held in those territories last month. In a resolution passed on Wednesday, the UN General Assembly urged the international community not to recognize the 4 regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia as part of the Russian Federation, stating that they are currently occupied by Russia as a result of aggression and must be returned to Ukrainian control immediately. The measure passed by a wide margin, with 143 member states voting in favor, while only Russia, Belarus, Syria, North Korea, and Nicaragua opposed the resolution. Another 35 countries abstained, among those India and China, which have both resisted Western pressure to take a firmer stance against Russia's military action. While Moscow has already recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states ahead of its invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, all 4 territories voted overwhelmingly to join Russia in referendums held last month. Most UN member states, including Ukraine, have refused to recognize those votes, however, calling them illegal while arguing the results cannot be trusted amid the Russian military presence. A similar plebiscite held in Ukraine soon after the 2014 Euromaidan revolution has also been rejected by the UN and much of the West, though the peninsula has now been under Russian administration for the better part of a decade. Russia's UN envoy initially pressed to hold Wednesday's vote in secret, saying that some countries may find it very difficult to express their views publicly, but the request was ultimately shut down. The General Assembly took up the measure automatically after Russia voted a similar effort, and the UN vetoed a similar effort in the UN Security Council, which has the power to enforce its decision. So, the UN General Assembly vote isn't really binding or have any teeth. Is just like a consensus vote. It is interesting that Russia asked to hold the vote in private, and I'm very interested, Connor, if the results of the votes would change significantly. My guess is that like 4 or 5 countries probably do vote just symbolically for the United States, but maybe if all of Latin America then abstains or something, once they have that little bit of veil of secrecy, would be a very interesting thing to see. Unfortunately, I don't think the UN's going to do that. So Russia denounces the vote, and while everybody's calling the annexation and the vote illegal, which whatever, under international law, I suppose it really is, Connor. And, everything from my point of view that states do is illegal. And one of the reasons I don't spend a lot of time just denouncing things as illegal is because just it wouldn't make it a legitimate thing if there was some law that allowed it to happen. Whenever a state annexes a new territory, there's going to be a significant amount of people in those territories that don't want to be a part of the annexation, and they're probably going to be forced out of their homes, and maybe in a violent and brutal way. And so this isn't a great thing that's happening. A lot of people are going to be hurt by this, and being illegal or legal really doesn't matter to me, especially on the international stage. The only time I bother to call a war illegal is if I'm like talking to an American audience about an American war. But if Congress voted and supported the war in Yemen, in my eyes, it wouldn't make it any more legitimate. It would still be the most horrendous thing the U.S. is doing. It would just mean that, we could damn all of our congressmen along with the president, the executive, and the Pentagon for it. Anyways, Connor, I'm going to kick this over to you and let you talk about China here.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a report in the New York Times. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, an article called U.S. Stepping Up Its Effort to Turn Taiwan into an Arms Depot. And so the New York Times put out a report saying that is Washington's policy, is to turn the island into a major weapons depot. So we have U.S. officials who've long called for turning Taiwan into a porcupine, which can withstand a Chinese attack. But in recent years, of course, the support for Taipei has been intensifying as Washington increasingly trains its sights on Beijing. But the U.S. wants Taiwan to focus its arms purchases on smaller, more mobile weapons as opposed to larger systems. The Times report says that the U.S. is conveying this to both officials in Taiwan and to the American arms industry. The Biden administration recently approved a $1.1 billion arms sale for Taipei that includes 60 Harpoon anti-ship missiles. We have, of course, the Senate pushing forward the Taiwan Policy Act of 2022, which would include $6.5 billion in military aid, as well as, it mandates, requires sanctions if there's a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Although the way it's worded, I believe it could be even less than an actual, blockade or invasion. It's pretty loosely worded. It's one of these things where they say if there's an increase in hostility or aggression, where it's more subjective and in the eyes of Washington as to what qualifies for the sanctions to be imposed. But they're very it's a very serious sanctions regime that covers key industries in China and much of the political elite, including President Xi as well. So and of course, it turns Taiwan into a major non-NATO ally, which is just this bill it would overturn the one China policy and make war between the U.S. and China inevitable. And probably sooner rather than later. That's how serious this is. And so, of course, the policy for both what we were just talking about, arming Ukraine for a decade and building up their defense industry and turning them into, as Politico says, a NATO state by default with all these NATO weapons. Of course, this policy, as well as the what we're gearing up for in Taiwan, is a major boon for the military-industrial complex, which is why we're seeing America and all of its NATO allies ramp up the production of all these weapons, as we were just speaking about. And the $6.5 billion for Taiwan and the Taiwan Policy Act is from the Foreign Military Financing Program, which is how the State Department, they actually they give foreign governments like Taiwan money, and then they go and buy the weapons directly from the U.S., from our military industrial complex. So it's just it's just a bunch of corporate welfare. But of course, this is just stoking the flames of another potential nuclear war. So Taiwan has been under increasing pressure since, of course, the Pelosi visit in August. Of course, these were the largest drills China's ever held around Taiwan. They simulated the blockade and fired missiles over the island for the first time. Beijing has also kept up pressure by regularly flying planes across the median line. Taiwan just came out and pointed that out again, that is becoming they're normalizing that. And it's something that they essentially didn't do. I mean, the statistics between the mid 50s during for the first or second Taiwan Strait crisis, and then up until really up until Donald Trump started sending over high-level officials. Um, uh, did they not, there was like four instances in that, in well over 50 years, in something like 70 years, where they actually flew planes over that median line. And then just in the last month, it's escalated to, or I should say, I believe in August, it was something like over 300. So, and again, this is all because of America's policy of poking China in the eyes and using Taiwan again to do it. And so now U.S. officials are concluding that Beijing would likely opt for a blockade rather than an invasion, which would be extremely difficult for China. It's not clear that they could even accomplish that. There's a lot of reason to doubt that. So, but what they're saying is that they're still, this policy, of course, though, is just making any kind of a conflict between China and Taiwan, and ultimately China and the U.S. Far more likely. So now we have a similar incident with Elon Musk that is sort of reminiscent of what happened in recent weeks when he proposed a sort of a peace process to end the war in Ukraine, and then we had Ukrainian officials telling him to F off and everything else. But now we have the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. thanking Elon for his proposal regarding Taiwan. And this is again from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on October 9th. So on Saturday, China's ambassador to the U.S. thanked Tesla and SpaceX CEO Elon Musk for suggesting a solution to the dispute over Taiwan, though his idea drew sharp criticism from Taiwanese officials. In an interview with the Financial Times, Musk said he believes a conflict over Taiwan is inevitable. War in the region could significantly hurt his business interests, as Tesla's Shanghai factory accounts for between 30 and 50% of the company's total production. And when asked about potential solutions to the Taiwan situation, Musk suggested a special administration zone could be created for Taiwan and said the arrangement could be, quote, more lenient than Hong Kong. As part of the handover agreement with the UK, China agreed to keep Hong Kong somewhat autonomous under the one country, two systems policy. The U.S. and other critics of China, of course, argue that the policy was violated by the national security law, which Beijing passed in 2020 as a response to massive protests that had rocked the city. But China has cited foreign interference as the reason they implemented the law, and the U.S. did give support to demonstrators in Hong Kong. So China has previously offered a one country, two systems arrangement for Taiwan and maintains that it seeks peaceful reunification, which is something that Qin Gang, again, the Chinese ambassador, reiterated when he thanked Musk on Twitter. He said, "I would like to thank Elon Musk for his call for peace across the Taiwan Strait and his idea about establishing a special administrative zone for Taiwan," Qin said. And actually, peaceful reunification and one country, two systems are our basic principles for resolving the Taiwan question and the best approach to realizing national reunification. Quinn goes on. He says, provided that China's sovereignty, security, and development interests are guaranteed after reunification, Taiwan will enjoy a high degree of autonomy as a special administrative region and a vast space for development. While Quinn liked Musk's suggestion, Taiwanese officials certainly did not. We have Haiso B. Kim, Taiwan's de facto ambassador to Washington, who wrote on Twitter that the island's freedom and democracy were, quote, not for sale. And Taiwanese lawmakers slam Musk's suggestion. And the comments over Taiwan marked the second time, of course, as I said, within a week, where Musk has been the center of this, a major geopolitical issue like this, and for floating the idea of his peace deal in Ukraine. Musk, as I said, was attacked by Zelensky, and I believe it was Podolyak, one of his advisors as well. No, it might have been the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, who was the one who said, "My diplomatic answer to you is F off." But of course, actually Musk has been supporting Ukraine's war against Russia by providing these Starlink terminals, and he's apparently spent $80 billion to do that, which I think, of course, that's wrong. But it's interesting that they're biting a hand, that's feeding them, which is another thing we had Biden recently bring up to Zelensky, that the Ukrainians need to stop acting so ungrateful, or it's going to be hard to ask Congress for more and more military aid, more billions of dollars for Ukraine. Now, Okay, this next story is about Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, who is saying that war with China is absolutely not an option. And this is again from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on October 13th. He says, amid heightened tensions across the Taiwan Strait, Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen on Monday said in comments aimed at Beijing that war is absolutely not an option for resolving the dispute over Taiwan. Quote, I want to make clear to the Beijing authorities that armed confrontation is absolutely not an option for our two sides, Tsai said in a speech marking Taiwan's National Day. Tsai's Democratic Progressive Party rejects the One China principle and considers Taiwan an independent state. Although Tsai has never formally declared independence, which could, of course, spark a Chinese military action, Beijing severed official contacts with Taiwan over her independence-leaning views when she was elected president in 2016. And there's a very important piece I recommend people check out at The Gray Zone by Gareth Porter from last year. We covered on the show all about how critical it was that the Barack Obama government actually shifted its long-term policy of what was called dual deterrence by really sort of maintaining the policy of strategic ambiguity with China, which it looks like the Biden administration is totally eschewing at this point. But they also used to not allow people like Tsai Ing-wen to become president. But that all changed after years of the ramp up against China had begun after Obama had inaugurated the Asia pivot in 2011, and under pressure from military leaders at what used to be called Pacific Command and is now Indo-Pacific Command, and of course people like hawks, neocon hawks like John McCain. They went ahead and did away with that policy and also ramped up the provocations in the South China Sea as well around the same time. With the freedom of navigation operations and things like this, violating Chinese territorial claims in those waters. Now, Tsai has called for China to respect Taiwan's sovereignty. Again, getting an idea of how hawkish she is. So she said, in order to resume contact, they need to respect our sovereignty. Quote, only by respecting the commitment of the Taiwanese people to our sovereignty, democracy, and freedom can there be a foundation for resuming constructive interaction across the Taiwan Strait, she said. While warning against war, she also spoke of Taiwan's efforts, again, going back to that New York Times piece that we began with, she's talking about how they're increasing military spending and domestic weapons production. As part of this effort, we are ramping up the mass production of precision missiles and high-performance naval vessels. And of course, let's see. So she also said that Taiwan is working to, quote, acquire, as they were mentioning in that piece in the Times, various small, highly mobile precision weapons that will help us develop comprehensive asymmetric warfare capabilities, ensuring that Taiwan is fully prepared to respond to external military threats. And of course, we have, this is all being done in the name of deterrence. But as Chinese officials like Qin Gang have warned before, this policy, they've explicitly warned that America's increasing support for what they call the independence forces of Taiwan, personified by people like Tsai Ing-wen, will make a conflict over the island more likely, involving, again, the U.S. and China. Now, okay, so the Biden administration put out a new national security strategy this week. And again, keeping with the pattern, at least since 2018 and really since the national defense strategy of this year, and I mean, this is the direction things were going in anyway, but it's becoming more and more explicit. They are putting China at the top of their enemies list, if you will, and seconding Russia. And so we see more of that again here. So this is from Dave DeCamp. Biden's national security strategy names China as the most consequential geopolitical challenge. And this is up at antiwar.com today. So on Wednesday, the White House released its long-awaited national security strategy that identifies China as the most consequential geopolitical challenge. While spending tens of billions on this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, American officials have repeatedly made clear that they see China as the larger challenge in the long term. The strategy says that the top foreign policy priorities for the U.S. are to compete with China and constrain Russia. According to the document, while Russia poses an immediate threat, China is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective. The strategy falls in line with previous Biden regime rhetoric. Biden officials have frequently accused Russia and China of looking to change the so-called rules-based order and frame competition with the two countries as a battle between autocracy and democracy, which is really just sort of the Democratic Party's version of what General Mattis and Donald Trump called great power competition in their the Pentagon's 2018 National Defense Strategy. It's all about just restarting the Cold War and targeting Russia and China overtly. Ominously, the strategy declares that the post-Cold War era is definitively over, and a competition is underway between the major powers to shape what comes next. Now, to compete with Russia and China, Washington will continue to attempt to divide the world into Cold War-style blocs, despite protests that that's not what they're trying to do. The strategy says the U.S. will increase cooperation with like-minded countries and deepen alliances and partnerships. But we can see with all their policies, with respect to, of course, NATO expansion surrounding Russia, attempting to build a mini NATO to surround Iran, the military pact that was signed in May with the trilateral agreement with the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, and of course AUKUS and all the Quad, all these different alliances that are being built in the Asia Pacific. That's obviously what they're doing, and they're saying that we're going to, with its like-minded countries, and we're deepening our alliances and partnerships. While framing the relationship with China and Russia as competition, the strategy also says that the U.S. is willing to work with its geopolitical rivals on shared challenges. And we'll get more into this in the next article. But delivering remarks on the strategy, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, claims the U.S. isn't trying to divide the world into blocks. Quote, "We will not try to divide the world into rigid blocks. We are not seeking to have competition tip over into confrontation or a new Cold War." So they're speaking out of both sides of their mouths. What's notable to me, of course, is that of course, experts on the national security state in the libertarian movement, people like Jacob Hornberger, have always said that the national security state, the CIA, the NSA, the Pentagon, they never intended to let the Cold War end. And so I just find it very interesting that they're saying now that the post-Cold War era is definitively over, and now we're going to find out what comes next. But also they have to say, oh, but we don't want a new Cold War. So it's a little ridiculous when you consider that that's exactly what they're doing. But of course, we don't expect honesty from Jake Sullivan. Now, but we're going to get more into Sullivan here. So this is from Responsible Statecraft. This is by Connor Eccles. It's called The Stake. It's up there today in their kiosk section. The stakes could not be higher. Top Biden aide says the world is at an inflection point. So this is more about the framing they're adding on to all of this. So he was speaking at Georgetown, of course, on Wednesday, and Sullivan argues the world is at an inflection point in history following the end of the post-Cold War era. I should just note that, Center for New American Security are some of the worst China hawks and one of the most powerful neocon think tanks. I mean, some people might dispute that term, but if Victoria Nuland was formerly a CEO, it's kind of hard to argue. Anyway, they're, since they came, I mean, they've dominated much of Biden's foreign policy positions in the administration, and they are funded by Georgetown as well, which is an interesting just note. But anyway, Sullivan says that we're at an inflection point in history following the end of the post-Cold War era. Quote, "This is a decisive decade for shaping the terms of competition, especially with China. The stakes could not be higher. The actions now will shape whether this decisive decade is an age of conflict and discord or the beginning of a more prosperous and stable future." Sullivan's comments came shortly after the White House put out the new national security strategy, which had been delayed for months because of the war in Ukraine. Now, the document paints a scary picture of the challenges facing the United States, with a particular focus on the threat posed by authoritarian powers like Russia and China, and also highlights transnational challenges like climate change and pandemic disease, and notes that Washington will have to work with adversaries in order to address these threats. And this is where it gets interesting. This points to a core tension in the wide-ranging document. It calls for vigorous competition with China and Russia, while also arguing that global powers must work together to face global threats. So George Beebe, the director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute, argued that this is a fundamental flaw in the administration's strategy. Quote, at no point does the Biden administration seem to reckon with the fundamental incoherence of its strategy, Beebe said, adding that the document notes the, quote, increasingly divided and zero-sum nature of the global order without offering practical paths to reduce division. Sarang Shidor, also of the Quincy Institute, agrees, quote, while it calls for engaging constructively with China on climate, which is a good sentiment that's likely essential to save the planet, the strategy provides no incentives or realistic pathway for China to come back to the table. So, of course, China cut off military talks and climate change talks with the U.S. after the Pelosi visit, which was deliberately provocative, and they knew that there would be consequences, and this could have been easily been foreseen. And so, of course, they're not offering them anything in order to restart those talks. And it's interesting how Sullivan says that. I'm going to get to this, but Sullivan doesn't really have an answer. So he says, let's see. Well, actually, she says the administration faces a contradiction between its actions on China containment and its imperative on climate action. And this is actually goes back to that Gareth Porter piece, because one of the things that was preventing Obama from being one of the concerns about eschewing the dual deterrence policy, which is basically you make sure that hawks like Tsai Ing-wen and the Democratic Progressive Party do not take power in the country, and you use your influence, America's influence, over Taipei to ensure that that doesn't happen, because it could cause a crisis and start a war where the U.S. would either intervene and it could go nuclear, or they don't intervene and Taiwan gets really destroyed or something. That's the idea. And so and then also they have strategic ambiguity, which makes sure that China doesn't get too aggressive. So, but one of the things that was holding that back was Obama was saying, well, I don't want to do this because I have to work with China on climate change in North Korea. And eventually the hawks won out. So they decided that that's not as important to the Democrats. It's more important to have this major arms build up and encircle China with the Asia pivot with hundreds of bases and 2/3 of all air and naval forces. It's just there's too much money and all of that for them to prioritize what they claim to be concerned about, which is climate change, when, of course, the Pentagon is the worst polluter in the whole planet. So, of course, they're hypocritical, but it shows that they don't even care about the usual propaganda about climate change and all this. They should have been all over Nord Stream 2 and the sabotage there if they really cared. But anyway, so they say we will engage constructively. Sullivan said in a preemptive response to these critiques, he says, well, the U.S., China, and Russia simply have no choice but to work together on issues like climate change. Quote, we will engage constructively with the PRC wherever we can, not as a favor, not in exchange for our principles, but because working together to solve common problems is what the world expects from responsible powers, Sullivan argued. So he has no answer. He later added the competition can help fight climate change by pushing great powers to invest in green technology, which is, a little ridiculous. But anyway, the document offers a somewhat new framing of the democracies versus autocracies framework that Biden had highlighted during the first years of his presidency. The strategy says that the Biden team will work with, quote, any nation that is willing to protect the rules-based order and uphold international law in every region of the world, meaning Washington will continue to ally with authoritarian states like apartheid Israel and the Gulf dictatorships that we support as long as they share our view of the world. But of course, that's been complicated recently with OPEC plus cutting oil production. We'll get to that. They mentioned that as well. So during the Sullivan says during the Cold War, we turned a lot of different regions in the world into proxy battlegrounds between the United States and the Soviet Union. A successful approach to dealing with competition with the PRC is not dividing the world into rigid blocks and not making our relations dependent on some kind of primacy fight, which is ridiculous because that's entirely what this is about. But notably, the strategy takes a veiled shot at Saudi Arabia and the UAE, a pair of authoritarian U.S. allies who have found themselves in Washington's crosshairs since the OPEC Plus oil production cut last week. So while the document places the primary blame for the global energy crisis on Russia's, quote, weaponization of the oil and gas supplies it controls, it also says that these problems have been exacerbated by OPEC's management of its own supply. When it comes to the broader Middle East, the document argues for a more limited military presence, lamenting that the American government in the past has too often defaulted to military-centric policies underpinned by an unrealistic faith in force and regime change to deliver sustainable outcomes. And that's a quote. But unlike its recent predecessors, the report only dedicates one page of the lengthy document to fighting terrorism. So that's it. It's just very interesting to see how they're pretending to still be concerned about these talks with China, but of course they have no intention, just like with Russia, to do anything to bring these Beijing or Moscow to the table in order, whether it's to end the war in Ukraine or whether it's to make some progress here on climate change or certainly arms control, anything like that. That is just not on the agenda. It's, as we can see very clearly, without any of these, we didn't even need a new strategy. It's just obvious that the military-industrial complex has been running this policy, and they're just going to escalate, and talks are bad for money, bad for the military-industrial complex. So it's not going to happen.
All right, Connor, thank you for doing the Iran update, and sorry for people who are watching the video version here and had some camera issues at the end of the show. It didn't reset when I tried to turn it back on, but here we are. And anyways, just share the show, libertarianinstitute.org. And just a reminder that right now at the Libertarian Institute, they are holding a fundraiser. I'm the opinion editor at the Institute, not at the Institute, antiwar.com. The opinion editor at antiwar.com, and pretty much everything that we end up doing, myself and Connor included, ends up at antiwar.com. So if you feel inclined, please go on over to support. We've already ran endorsements from Noam Chomsky and Colonel Douglas McGregor. Today we got John Mearsheimer who's saying like, hey, this is really important. Everybody, please do what you can, donate. So really appreciate that, and thank you for coming back on, Connor.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.